Although ours is a course on federalism and decentralization, we have to acknowledge the importance of relevant factors that are beyond federalism and decentralization in a strict sense. Things happening in the world politics and things international organizations did all influence federalism and decentralization in Africa. And we'll leave the detailed discussion of the role of international organizations and experts to the next module, but here we should highlight the end of the Cold War as an enabling background factor to the continent's democratization and indeed the continent's economic growth. The changing world order of the early 1990s brought seismic changes to the African continent. African states no longer had to choose between the two competing power blocs and the respective economic and political ideologies of these power blocs. There was now a liberal democratic consensus on how to bring economic development to the developing world, and there was international, political, financial and organizational support for those who were ready to undertake reforms to this end. Decentralization was often a core component of reform projects aiming to shrink the state and expand the market. Throughout the continent, international organizations and various donors spearheaded and supported various decentralization initiatives. After all, decentralization had a good track record in the West. Most advanced economies happen to have decentralized political systems with strong local governments. So throughout the Western world, decentralization seemed to correlate with indicators of good governance. Bringing democracy closer to citizens, the empowerment of local communities, and the political accountability and transparency that come with small-scale politics were the component parts of this notion of good governance. But it was especially in the policy field that decentralization carried with it promises to quickly help lift Africa's economic standards. It was not long before most countries to the south of the Sahara adopted decentralization, often part of comprehensive reform projects aiming to bring economic development. While decentralization reforms had focused on development, they had much varied consequences. In terms of pro forma institutions, what was constructed in Africa looked identical to what existed in the West. But the political and economic context into which reforms were introduced influenced the very workings of these decentralized institutions. Reforms introduced with the economic development goals in mind had different political consequences, and not all of it anticipated or intended. In broad terms, what unites the varied consequences is that they could all be seen as uncodified. That is to say, factors external to the formal institutional design have often come to be part of the workings of decentralized institutions. One key factor here is the party system in place. Whether or not decentralization could deliver on its promises hinge upon whether different political parties occupy the various local, regional and national levels of government. When a single dominant national party sits above decentralized institutions, no matter how expertly and elaborately designed, intra-party politics seems to sit above these decentralized institutions and takes precedence. This means that national political patterns will tend to superimpose themselves onto the regional and the local. Creating decentralized institutions with a stroke of pen does not automatically bring out the same good governance indicators that correlate with decentralization in the West. Lack of governance capacity at the local level, infrastructural weaknesses, and deficiencies in personnel have prevented many local governments from meeting their new competences and responsibilities. In order to get things done, some local governments have become dependent on the center for resources, for know-how and patronage. In such cases, formal decentralization obscures how political power is simultaneously re-centralized. A varied but nonetheless visible pattern that also emerges is the resurgence of traditional authorities and traditional leadership. The creation of local government has made it easier for traditional chiefs and village elders to exert their uncodified forms of political authority in these much smaller settings. Almost everywhere in Africa, decentralization reforms of the 1990s have blown new life into traditional authorities and leadership whose powers and influence had remained dormant throughout most of the 19th century. After all, decentralized institutions are not painted onto blank canvases. History has left its mark on the political landscape in a way that influences the present. The resilience of traditional authorities throughout pre-colonial, colonial and post-colonial times attest to this. A country's GDP is the total market value of all final goods and services produced annually. It is measured in reference to prices in a past base year. Now, because of recent and rapid growth and diversification of African economies, official GDP figures often require revision in Africa. New industries have been absent from earlier calculations. Relative changes in productivity across different industries exist. Various economic sectors which had remained outside official records have only recently been formalized. Now, all this means that economic statistics play a catching-up game. Yet, these statistical revisions can have direct repercussions on the very things they seek to measure. When Ghana updated its economic statistics in 2010 in order to correct the accumulating inaccuracies in its estimates of growth, the country's GDP went up by a whopping 60%. Of course, this was a statistical and not a real increase. The revised figures did not change the lives of ordinary citizens overnight, but the updated GDP figures influence national and international economic policies, which are in turn likely to change the lives in the long run, because the increase in GDP suddenly turned Ghana into a middle-income country overnight, potentially leading to a loss in foreign aid, but a likely increase in foreign direct investment and trade. It is likely that soon others will join the ranks of middle-income countries in Africa. Yet, most international organizations and donors see decentralization as a way to bring economic development to lesser developed parts of the world. In some economic sectors, the recent boom in Africa has forced, in fact, a rethink of the mindset based on helping Africa through foreign aid. There are still very active international organizations, aid agencies, donors and non-governmental organizations, but now we also have international businesses and countries like China, India and Turkey, whose economic interests in Africa are not cloaked within development concerns. So far, there is very little comprehensive analysis of how decentralization affects the business environment, particularly in terms of foreign direct investment. Now, maybe you will be the one writing the book on this. So I'll see you next time.